Before we embark on this harrowing tale of psychotic episodes and urinary incontinence, I'd just like to thank you all for the overwhelming reception to my last video. Expect way more of this type of content in the future. I'm definitely going to base my channel around psychedelics more so. I've got numerous stories in the vein of these trip reports up my sleeve. Now, without further ado, let's dive into this one, shall we? This twisted incident occurred sometime during the first half of 2017, by far the most fucked up year of my life for a multitude of reasons, but if you've watched the last part, you probably already realised that. It had been just over a year since sixth form and I was feeling particularly lost in life. Following my time there, a period in which I first undertook the dark arts of substance abuse, my ambitions in life were completely aimless. I didn't have any interest in continuing my education at university, nor was I invested in creating a career for myself. I was just going through the motions at a shitty, dead-end construction job that my dad managed to sort out for me. This was an especially depressing year for me. The job I had didn't stimulate me in any meaningful way, and I was working for an absolute pittance. And somehow, to make things worse, I became embroiled in an exceptionally toxic relationship towards the end of 2016, which only gradually got more and more venomous as the months went on by. Up to this point, I'd never really had a properly intimate relationship. I irrationally assumed that this was my only shot at love due to my lack of any meaningful experiences with women in the past. I clung on to this destructive partner like superglue, and this resulted in some of the most traumatic and damaging experiences I've had to date. So, as you can probably tell, I was boiling in a melting pot of toxicity around this time. There couldn't have been a better time to lose my mind, really. So, it was the night of the Rakes party, a mate of mine that was revered for hosting some of the messiest sessions you could ever hope to attend. My girlfriend at the time was unhappy with the news of my attendance. She would often berate me for going to parties and getting seshed up, which was especially rich because she herself was also stuck in an even deeper substance abuse problem than my own. A terrible combination of people for a relationship, I know, but I was young, dumb, and didn't know any better. Unsurprisingly, I dismissed her disapproval and went anyway. This was going to be a mad night for sure. Me and my friend Buckers had recently picked up some triple dipped tabs earlier in the day and planned to drop several of them for the party. We embarked on our way to the Rakes' abode, eagerly anticipating the twisted shenanigans of the night ahead. Once we rocked up, the sesh was in full swing. Everyone looked to be having a great time, thoroughly intoxicating themselves with the particular poison, and the speakers were blaring some wonderfully mucky, hypnotic beats. After an hour or so of conversing with our friends and soaking in the bassy tunes, we decided it was time to take things up a notch. Me and Buckers took some tabs each. My memory is hazy regarding the amount, but I think I must have consumed at least 450 UG, with Buckers' dose also being in that margin to my knowledge. This was my highest dose to date, and I'd been gradually increasing it by 50 UG at every opportunity I got to take LSD, namely at sessions or the occasional fishing trip. Back then, I had little to no knowledge of the higher psychedelic states one could reach for a greater dose. In my previous video, I spoke of the time my friend Keith leapt from my balcony during a fit of his violent ego death, but what I failed to mention was that very same night, another of my friends had an even more chaotic ego death that resulted in a mass brawl and my house nearly getting trashed from the ensuing chaos, eventually attracting the attention of the police. If I had been wiser and probably understood what my friends went through that night, I would have prevented my own descent into madness. But to no surprise, I naively presumed that increasing the amount taken would purely enhance the visuals and enjoyment of the trip, much like my past few times taking acid. I made the assumption that I was incapable of going as west as my friends had done earlier in the year. I mean, I'd taken acid more times than any of my other mates up to this point. I believed I was a well-versed psychonaut. Surely it would all go to plan. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. Several hours into the trip, I was noticing just how intense the effects were as I laid in sheer hysterics on the bathroom floor, amusingly observing my mate and his girlfriend's jaw flying off whilst they chatted complete and utter shit wired out their heads on MDMA. It was so hysterical, in fact, that I ended up having to crawl out of the bathroom and run outside for a breath of fresh air. I'd never laughed like this before. I started to perceive existence as a massive joke, of which my life was the punchline. This fit of uncontrollable laughter was not letting up in the slightest, and began to freak me the fuck out. I decided I wasn't in any fit state to converse with most people at this point, and desperately needed to find someone on my level before I lost my mind to the intense bouts of laughter. I went to find Bookers to see how his trip was panning out. I found him in one of the quieter rooms of the house, and sat with him and a few others having some amazingly in-depth discussions and reminiscing on all the great times we've had as a friend group. One of the really beautiful things about acid is actually elevating your love for other people and yourself, and this was the first time I'd ever taken acid and truly realised this. My friends are some of the most amazingly weird individuals you could ever hope to meet, and I realised how utterly blessed I was to know such wonderfully varied people. This was in stark contrast to my experiences growing up, where I didn't really have many friends and found it difficult to relate to people at my school. An immense wave of gratitude washed over me, and I was finally at peace from the debilitating series of laughter. Bookers had the wise idea to roll up a joint for us to smoke at the peak, and being the bud fiend I was, embraced this idea with open arms. Smoking weed on acid in the past felt amazing, and really elevated the trip, so naturally I thought this would have gone hand in hand with the 450 UG I took. And luckily, this was not the case this time round. Soon after blazing through the hogger that Bookers had crafted, I noticed the trip began to imbue itself with a noticeably different, almost sinister feeling, vastly different and more alien than any of my previous experiences with LSD. My mind began to fully perceive itself as being some form of godlike entity. Not the orthodox God that we have become so accustomed to having been forced down our throats via dogmatic religion, but the actual God that humanity has been attempting to point to through all of its mystical and religious traditions and practices. Much to my dismay, being an atheist, I sought to detangle myself from the spiderweb of these delusions of grandeur by using logic and reason. I would soon find out that logic and reason are completely impossible to maintain during this ego-death experience. I just placed complete and utter faith on them through my egoic existence and the culture that has been imprinted upon my mind throughout my life experiences. The body load began to intensify greatly, and me and Bookers began to discuss things so unbelievably deeply that we both stopped speaking and began to communicate telepathically. As he would occasionally leave the room, I noticed I was able to transmit information to him from my mind whilst he was somewhere else in the house, and in turn I would receive information back from him. Mental, I know, but this is what was happening, and it couldn't have felt more real. I can guarantee if you have this experience for yourself, this will be realer than anything you've ever experienced. To someone who was stuck within the materialistic scientific paradigm at the time, this ethereal, mystical experience knocked me back significantly. It completely destroyed my entire perception of reality, and it was overwhelming in every sense of the word. Just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, Lisa, a girl who stayed in the room and chatted with us through the most intense period of the trip, and who was watching me and Bookers lose our marbles, became limp all of a sudden, flopping over onto the floor and laying there in front of us. I can't speak for Bookers, but I was utterly convinced this girl had just died. One minute she was conscious, the next minute she was completely lifeless. We even moved her around to no avail. There was absolutely no reaction coming from her. Well, this was it. This is what sent me into the deep end. This sight propelled my consciousness into profoundly contemplating the very nature of death, further solidifying my God complex. Soon after, Lisa rose up and began laughing at how fooled we were into thinking she was unconscious. It was pretty funny, to be fair. We were absolutely fucked. This brief return to normality was obliterated after Lisa complimented both me and Bookers on our appearances and how entertaining we'd been. She was enamoured with how weird and amusing we both were and told us we had made her night. As lovely as this sounds, this was it for me. Hearing all this was too much for my feeble ego to comprehend, And right there, like magic, it happened. I died. In that instant, I became distinctly aware that nobody had ever complimented me and my appearance in such a genuine manner, not even my girlfriend at the time. Hearing such heartfelt words washed away a lifetime's worth of anxiety and insecurity over my looks. Baggage I'd been carrying with me my entire life washed away in an instant and was replaced with an orgasmic pulsation that began at my pelvis and reached to the top of my head. A Kundalini awakening, for those of you who know what that is. But, to put it in layman's terms, for lack of a better word, I exploded. There was no Johnny Howard. There was no hard, material reality. There was no other. There was only consciousness in its purest form. Nothingness. I convulsed on the floor in a sea of tears, experiencing indescribable visions of distant, dreamlike worlds like those out of a video game or an animation that extended infinitely in every single direction, forever. These bubble realms extended beyond the walls of the room I was in, and I perceived each of them as infinite states of being that consciousness, or God, has been dreaming up in its infinite capability for creativity, with my own relative experience being one of them, but which has already existed for an eternity. I became fully aware of the intercorrelated depth of every single point of reality, both at the micro and macro level. As above, so below, they say. This was awe-inspiring, so much so in fact, that I went absolutely insane. I leapt up and exclaimed with a manic tone in my voice, "Johnny Howard spunked into the universe, go find me lad." Over and over and over again. I said this because, well, that's exactly what I felt had happened to me. It felt like I had intercourse with the universe itself, and I was experiencing some form of cosmic orgasm better than any you could imagine having as a human. All I could do was speak in utter gibberish about what I was experiencing. I had never felt anything like this before. I ran into the rake's mum's room and jumped onto the bed, squirming around incessantly, screaming and shouting about how I had become everything in existence and also nothing. As you would expect, this freaked people out majorly. Everyone found it funny at first, but it became increasingly worrying to people as I began to throw my belongings around the room, talk to people that weren't there, and attempt to undress myself in front of everybody, throwing my belt at my good friend Ethan, who I had perceived as being a cartoon character. Like in my previous video, notions of experiencing everybody's collective baggage of karma that they'd accrued through all their past lives and current life was being implanted into my consciousness. I entered deeper into the Godhead, and feelings of euphoria washed over my entire body like nothing I'd ever experienced. I believed that this was truly the end of my life. Sometime during my psychotic escapades, I drenched my entire pants in piss. Whilst writhing around on the rake's mother's bed, I lost control of my bodily functions and completely pissed my pants. Having no idea at the time, I believed I'd spunked myself and that nothing was awry, but in reality, everyone had seen me leak a great deal of fluid all over the bed. This prompted me to run to the corner of the room and demand someone give me a knife to end this psychedelic nightmare so that I could properly merge with God. Obviously, everyone refused, but this only made my mental situation worse. I began to see this reality I was in as the end of the entire fucking world, and I could notice auditory hallucinations of rockets being fired, police sirens in abundance, and general chaos ensuing in the streets outside, full to the brim with death and suffering, of which this house was the only respite from such. After an hour or two of being fucking crazy, I asked to see Bookers, but to my dismay, he had fled the party earlier when I started going skits-hydro. I can't blame him though, that was definitely the wisest move you could have made in this scenario. I began to have conversations with people about the state of my life and the experiences I'd had that led up to this moment. My consciousness was talking back to me through other people, and this dissolved any sense of there being other people with their own consciousness around me. It was all just me, God, and in the infinite nature of the universe, I am bound to live through their relative experiences as my own. I fully understood what yogis, shamans, Buddhists, etc., what they really meant when they talked about reincarnation. I have lived infinite lives and will continue to do so for all of time. As will you, because you are me. The very idea of infinity means that all is one. It's so one, in fact, that there is only a single consciousness manifesting what it knows conceptually and experiencing it in what we know of as material reality. But the deeper facet to this is that this is all just one big illusion created by the enormously intelligent capabilities of our senses, creating this world. Every time you open and close your eyes, you literally form reality. I then received a profound insight into the nature of the universe and reality. If you meditate intensely for years on end, or take enough of a psychedelic drug, the barriers of the world dissolve, and you see life for what it really is. A dream. So, following all this, my friends had no choice but to ring up one of my best mates, Manly, to come and retrieve me and to take me somewhere where I didn't pose a threat to myself or other people. I'm lucky that everyone was so open-minded enough to realise the pain that I was actually going through, and that I wasn't actually a lunatic. Manly was especially sympathetic with my plight. He'd seen me go west off acid numerous times in the past when I was first starting out. I was still utterly dazed from this experience. I was so gone, in fact, that I requested he drop me off at my girlfriend's house. Bad mistake. She was not happy to see how mental I'd gone, and in my absence she'd been getting up to some pretty destructive stuff that really fucked with my trip. As the acid wore off and I slowly grounded myself back into reality, I began to sink into a deep depression. I had gone from basking in the glowing warmth of complete, pure consciousness to being stuck in my egoic hell again, bogged down by all the things in my life that I perceived as being bad. But from this trip, I realised that it was all just a matter of perception. Whether you're anxious or depressed, it really is just a matter of perspective and how you see the world. The only thing that's evil or bad about reality is the narrative that we spin to ourselves about it, when in actuality what's happening is just an amalgamation of infinite consciousness's love manifested in physical form, even in the most utterly bizarre and twisted ways you wouldn't egoically think of as a human. The next few days were really tough, and I fully thought I had lost my mind and it would never be coming back. This would actually stick with me up until my trip on the Curry Mile, where everything finally fell into place and I realised what the true meaning of spirituality really is. 3 years on from this event, and my entire life has changed dramatically. I'm no longer depressed, pursue spirituality, and have been truly blessed with the most marvellous loving partner I could have ever asked for, something I couldn't have even imagined having in 2017. Strangely enough, during the most intense point of my ego death, I visualised myself sat on Mount Fuji in Japan, somewhere I have been enamoured with visiting my entire life, what with my artistic enthusiasm for anime and games and Japanese culture. I sat there with someone I loved very, very deeply, and someone that meant the absolute world to me, but who surprisingly was not the partner I had at the time of the trip. This made me question my whole relationship with the other person, and after a grueling few months clinging to them, and after this incident, I finally escaped the distressing relationship that plagued my entire year. As of 2020, me and my amazing girlfriend are planning on travelling Japan in the not too distant future. I know now that my nuclear trip from years before briefly bestowed me with this power of clairvoyance, something else I have experienced in later ego deaths, the ability to perceive the future beyond conventional senses. And the vision of me and my girlfriend on Mount Fuji is something that I am inevitably going to actualise in my direct experience within reality. The trip was telling me that my life was going to sort itself out. The infinite goodness of consciousness that obliterated my ego 3 years ago showed me that everything and nothing is made out of love, and that sometimes the only way to properly know and feel what sanity truly is to go totally and utterly insane.